Doesn't mean we're not excited about being here. So thank you for joining us for the new Contemporary Arab Thought. Some of you online may not know me, but I am Fida Adely, and I'm the Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University and the Kavis and Hala Salam Maksud Chair in Arab Studies. So I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event, the new Contemporary Arab Thought. Dr. Suzanne Kassab will discuss the relationships between cultural and political critique in the work of major Arab thinkers, revisiting her seminal work, Contemporary Arab Thought, in light of the 2011 uprisings and the regional challenges that have followed in the intervening years. Dr. Kassab is an associate professor of philosophy at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. She's the author of Contemporary Arab Thought, Cultural Critique and Comparative Perspective, which will soon appear in a second edition with a new introduction. She's also the author of Enlightenment on the Eve of Revolution, the Egyptian and Syrian Debates. Both have been translated into Arabic, and she received the 2013 Sheikh Zayed Book Award for the translation of Contemporary Arab Thought into Arabic. So Dr. Kassab will begin with a presentation, and then we will open it up for questions. And for those of you online, please use the Zoom Q&A feature to ask questions. And with that in mind, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kassab.
Hello, everyone. Do you hear me? Okay. I'm very happy to be with you. I would have preferred to be there in person, but inshallah, another time. So I'm going to share my screen to make a PowerPoint presentation for about, say, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for questions. And here is my screen. Do you see it? I don't hear you. Can you make signs?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. So I thought this was a precious occasion for me to present the new introduction I wrote for the second edition of my book. And in the process, it was an exercise in reflecting on the about 30 years of working on contemporary Arab thought. So it started in the mid-90s, and it's been going on since then. So my presentation will have two parts. First, I will share with you some remarks in my revisiting of the 2010 edition. And then in the second part, I will share with you some of the beginnings of another story starting 2010. So let me start with this 2010 edition, which might be familiar to some of you. So in this book, I wanted to write a contemporary history of Arab thought. Roughly after 67, between 1967 and 2010. And I wrote this book primarily for myself because I discovered at some point when I started being interested in contemporary Arab thought that it was almost impossible to find a history of it. Like if you wanted to know what were people in my region talking about, you couldn't find a reference book. You couldn't find people who would, guide you to certain works or certain thinkers. So it was the outcome of a long investigation. And I think there is something to be said, and I always mention this, about the worthiness of writing, of being interested at all in contemporary Arab thought or Iranian thought or Turkish thought or Indian thought. In our parts of the world, it seems to me that contemporary debates, local debates, are regarded not to be worth knowing. That in fact, Perhaps in the Islamic sphere, it would be worth knowing something about Averroes, Avicenna, so the classical Islamic history, or of course about modern and any epoch of Western history. But who would really give money to go and read Taha Hussein in a university? And I think, of course, that tells a lot about how we look at our own intellectual efforts and intellectual history. Now, I didn't, of course, try to write an exhaustive history, and I would have been totally incapable of doing that. What I wanted to know, to get, was a sense of what was being debated and what were the main concerns, how those concerns were being approached, by whom. And so it seems to me that one of the concerns, major concerns, was this business of cultural malaise or cultural crisis, al-azama, and how people dealt with it. I was not interested in ideologies. I wanted to know about critical approaches. And what interested me at the time, I was in New York by chance. I had a couple of research fellowships, and it is in New York, in the US in general, that I discovered debates among Black Americans and then among Latin Americans. And that, for me, opened up a whole new horizon of work on contemporary thought. The importance of having comparative perspective. Now, I won't tell you the whole story of 2010, the book, but I will just make one remark about how this issue of cultural crisis was approached. It seems to me that there were two readings, two lines that I could detect. The first one, very loud, was of course the culturalist one, that we had a crisis because there was something wrong in our culture. That's the, you explain cultural issues through culture and you go around in this never-ending circle. And at the time, well, maybe even now, it seemed like obvious, of course, that, there is a cultural issue here and how to fix it. It was because we had become too westernized or not enough westernized. We had become modernized. We had not become modernized. We had forgotten our tradition. We were too much stuck to our tradition, etc. But there was another reading that interested me in particular because it made more sense and was more it had more of an explanatory power. It put the finger on really the pulse of events, of namely the political reading, to say that what was wrong in our culture, in our societies, in our countries, had something to do with our political situation. Briefly, the lack of democracy, the lack of political participation. Now, of course, being what they are, our regimes were not very welcoming of those discourses. And given the repression in many of our countries, these discourses didn't make it to television, didn't make it to the newspapers. They were what I call a minority report. Okay. So this is what I tried to do in 2010. Well, roughly in about a decade and a half from 1995, when I started being interested in all of this and when the book appeared. Then, my book came out in 2010, and you know that in December 2010, the Arab Revolt started in Tunisia. And this opened up, of course, another story to tell, one that I've been trying to follow as best I can, a very eventful time. And I thought that this collage of the Syrian painter Tammam Azzam, called Statue of Liberty from 2012, was one good representation of these times, the rubbles, the destruction we find ourselves in the region. And I thought that the ambiguity of this representation was quite telling or corresponded to the state we are in. Namely, you don't know if it's the destruction of liberty or whether from this rubble some liberty for us will emerge slowly. So, this Statue of Liberty, between the two editions, the 2010 and the book is hopefully coming out in April in a couple of months. In between the two editions, we had the Arab revolts, which are still ongoing. And then we had the Gaza war, which is also ongoing. And I think these are two marking events. Among others, we have the Sudanese war, we have all kinds of other catastrophes and transformations. But I think for my purposes, I would like here to focus on these two chain of events. Now, let me speak a little bit about the critical revisit that I'm doing in the new introduction as I look back at the book I wrote in 2010. These are some of the observations I had. First of all, that basically what I did is to produce a text about texts. It's a book about books. When I'm frustrated about what I did, I say, my work was a work of aluil. It is said, this said that, this book said this, the other guy said that, and well. Now, I think it was necessary. I needed to know who's saying what about what. I did a bit of it. So I think that this kind of text study is necessary, but it is definitely insufficient if we want to know, if we want to claim that we have some understanding of the intellectual scene. One of the shortcomings, for instance, was that this study of Arab thought was isolated from other fields. For instance, Arab art history, Arab cultural studies, social history, social science of the intellectual field, gender studies. These are, and I'm going to show some specimen of works that have emerged since then, or even at the time, that I think have a lot to say, had a lot to tell us about the Arab intellectual scene. But up till now, the potential of cross-pollination hasn't been exploited. We know nothing, very little, let me say, about a social history of some of the institutions which really shaped the field. Let me give you an example. مركز دراسات الوحدة العربية in Beirut, the Center of Arab Unity Studies, which for about 3 decades really shaped the field. They are the ones who organized huge conferences, brought together scholars and thinkers, decided on the agenda, defined the big themes, dominated the publishing scene. Okay, so what do we know about that center? Who were the people behind it? like I'm speaking about really a serious study, a social scientific study of that center. What were the political circumstances or influences that shaped the center itself? What are the financial channels that made this center possible, etc., etc.? What do we know about the social history of research centers, universities, important figures? Close to nothing. So all we had were this guy wrote this book, and most of them are guys. That other guy wrote these other tens of books. So we read this, we read that, and we try to sort of analyze and make sense, but in great poverty about all of the circumstantial aspect of the field. As a result, this is a field in isolation. There is logocentrism. In other words, it's as if thought consisted only of this type of analytical writing, isolated from other forms of thinking. I think that artists think, that musicians think, literary figures think. It's a great impoverishment. It's a great mistake, in fact, to think that we can speak of contemporary Arab thought by not being in conversation with those other fields. And finally, by not benefiting from much that is being produced in gender studies, in Arab, contemporary Arab gender studies, we end up privileging patriarchal discourses. Well, the scene has been dominated by men of a certain age, of a certain type. And this too, I think, needs to be put in perspective, and we need to allow other figures to participate, to appear on the scene. So this means also perhaps we need to look at the unusual places or the not usual suspects, or the standard places where thought is supposed to be produced. Maybe thought is being produced elsewhere, not in the big universities, not in the big publishing houses, not by the big men with the mustache. So again, an invitation to enlarge the spectrum. Now, let me give you quickly some examples of what I mean. For instance, fantastic work has been done in studies of the editing sector. Franck Mermier, a French anthropologist, has written stuff that is relevant to somebody who's interested in contemporary Arab thought. Le Livre et la Ville, I think, is a great source of information. Work that has been done in the Egyptian literary field, the works of Jacquemont, of Samia Mehriz, of Yves González Quijano, can tell us a lot, I think, can teach us. I always say to Richard Jacquemont, I wish we could clone you to do a similar work in the field of thought, what he did for Egyptian literary writers. Then cultural studies. Tariq Sabri offered us some valuable foundational works. More recently, something on pop culture in Egypt was produced. I think this interest, these studies of popular culture can be should be, I mean, commonsensically, if I'm a thinker مفكر. And I pretend to claim to know what Arabs are thinking or should be thinking. I should be in touch. I should somehow know what's going on in society, outside the little elite of thinkers. Recently, fantastic work is being produced in contemporary graphic design history. I mean, these two works are absolutely wonderful. The book of Zena Maasri, Cosmopolitan Radicalism, and the book of Bahia Shahab and Haytham Nawar, History of Arab Graphic Design, really introduces us to a contemporary history, a recent history of how the visual has evolved in our societies. And maybe that visual, that's my line now, can tell us something, can enrich our understanding of contemporary thought. Then art history. It has been a booming field. The foundational work of Nada Shabout in 2007, Modern Arab Art, and then the primary documents edited by her and some of her colleagues is a very precious reference work that can tell us about how art also has been evolving. And gender studies. This is an example of how seminal works in gender studies can be. This is Maya Mikdashi's book on sectarianism, where she looks, for instance, at the Lebanese state through the prism of gender and personal law, الأحوال الشخصية, to explain this bizarre structure that is the structure of my country. So I think gender here, you can no longer reflect on our realities without including the gender prism. Now, if I look only at these few books, mine, but also Ibrahim Abu Rabia's book from 2003, then Nada Shabout, then Tariq Sabri, in intellectual history, art history, cultural studies, I notice that there has been no cross-pollination whatsoever. I think I wouldn't like to continue like this. I think no, we need to benefit from what is being offered by other fields. Now, if we don't do that, the result is an insufficient understanding. We cannot be claiming that we have an understanding of the Arab intellectual field without knowing what's happening in these, without taking stock of what is being produced in those neighboring fields. Otherwise, it's not only knowledge that we would be missing, but also how we would be looking at this intellectual field. If we don't take my thinking is that if we don't take the circumstantial aspect of this intellectual field, it looks as if you put Arabs together, you get the themes that you get the debates that you get. That's not true. If we had other financial channels, other personalities, other totally contingent factors, we might have ended with different dominating themes. Now, I'm not saying that it's all contingent and haphazard, but I'm saying that the circumstantial is very important in removing from that field that wrong aspect of naturalness. essentialist and exceptionalist and ahistoricist. I mean, you know it all. If we don't take notice of what is happening in our neighboring fields, we would be also perpetuating the patriarchal discourse and perpetuating a poor logocentric approach to all of this. Now, it is to take off from all of these limitations that I now am interested to make that connection, in my case, with the visual arts. And this is why I very intentionally chose this as a cover of the new edition. It is by the Lebanese artist Samir Sayer from 2014, inspired, as he says, by the Arab revolts. It says freedom, حرية. But it is the idea of Samir, as he says it, he's also a writer and a poet, that in fact his approach to calligraphy, it's not really calligraphy. It's not a playful representation of a word in a different form of calligraphy. His idea is to liberate letters from the meaning content and just play with forms. And that's a bit the gesture I wanted to express, that I too, I'm not going out of the content, but I would like to widen my understanding, my look at Arab thought by learning a little bit what is happening, what has been happening in the visual field. And I have a couple of hypotheses there. And my linking, if you want, is focused on a particular point. You know, there's this eternal question of modernity and authenticity and tradition and selfhood and what have you. I am curious to see whether artists, contemporary Arab artists from 67 onwards, had the same issues as analytical writers. How did they approach the business of modernity and change and tradition and identity and selfhood? So that's the thing I'm playing with nowadays. So this was the first part of my presentation. So reflections on how that book was written, how I wrote that book, and how I need to go beyond those limitations. But then came 2010, 2011, the Arab revolts. And this is a rupture. I mean, it was a consensus that 1967 was a turning point because of that dramatic event of the Arab defeat. And I think it's another consensus today that 2011 will be definitely a turning point in the history of the region. And as you know, these revolts are still going on. And needless to tell you that, like everybody else in the region, I was following these developments very closely and paying special attention for intellectual transformations along these changes. Now, I thought, you see, I am interested in the visual. Here, to one illustration, if you want, of the revolts, I was not going to show you photos of events that I'm sure are very familiar to you, but I thought this sculpture by Syrian sculptor Asim al-Basha, I think in the mid-2010, representing watching out for the barrel bomb. You know that the Assad regime threw for years barrel bombs on people's houses and neighborhoods. So this is a representation of somebody looking watching out for a barrel bomb, just as an illustration of what the region has been going through. And of course, given the changes, given that dramatic rupture, the question is, was the contemporary I talked about in my book in 2010 still contemporaneous? What is the contemporary today? Is it the same as that other contemporary? Not only that, but I raised the question also to express the difficulty of defining the moment. I think you agree with me that there has been so much happening and still happening in the area that it is very difficult to capture. I think no human mind would be able to claim that one is able to capture, to make sense, to put things in some form and shape to say, this is the moment, this is what is happening. Another moment of what we're going through is this painting by Yusuf Abdelki, again a Syrian painter, of a martyr's mother. I'm sorry, both illustrations are of a tragic nature, but because most of what we've been going through is, alas, tragic. And then there was the Gaza war. And I think that in itself, I mean, the thing is, by the time you sort of start saying, okay, 2011 is a turning point. Now let me see, what do I observe? What is happening? What is happening to us? What is happening to the intellectual scene? Who is writing what? How are people making sense of what is happening? And there you have another war. So the last section I wrote in my introduction was in relation to the Gaza war. But by the time it went to the publisher, the Assad regime had fallen, and we are now in another new chapter. So impossible really to keep up with what is happening. So I will end with some comparison between before and after 2011. Of course, only very, very, very tentatively. I would never pretend to really know what is happening or understand what is happening, but some observations I think I am able to do. If we look at before 2011, the big themes, and I have up there, I have dominating in the quotation marks. So because it's not an object, an innocent or a non-circumstantial domination. So what were the loud discourses? Of course, a lot of talk about autonomous thought, that we want to have an Arab philosophy, we want to have an Islamic science, we want to be authentic, we don't want to be imitating anybody else. So a lot of writings in that direction. Then the binaries, tradition and modernity, us and them, and all of that. And that's this business of Arab reason, whether there is such a thing as a set of characteristics that define our mind. Now, 2011, I think, showed to some of us at least that these topics that were so, written about as if they were the most pressing issues were not at all on the reality scene. I mean, we didn't see anybody going out in the streets of Tunisia or Morocco or Cairo or Yemen or Iraq or Egypt saying, we need authenticity. That tradition is really, really missing. No, people went out risking their lives for other issues. So it makes you think, So whose problems were these problems? Tradition and modernity, this and that. And some of us really cannot but notice the disconnect with reality, with much of the dominating debates. Now, there is also the Minority Report, because there are these loud in the sense that they were ubiquitous everywhere, and with such fervor, you thought that really the burning issues of our societies were these. Modernization was such, you slept and woke up wondering what's happening to tradition. And here I go back to the political and the culturalist reading. Of course, these kind of binaries and these kind of discourses were more or less related to the culturalist approach, whereas the Minority Report was talking about something else, about repression, the lack of political participation, the disappearance of the people, a whole. So which makes me think that there were thinkers who were more in touch with reality, with the reality of their societies, and who did write about these issues. Now let me move to after 2011. You all heard the concern with dignity and freedom, so a lot of writings on that. But perhaps, and this is why the two illustrations from the barrel bomb and the martyr's mother, it's our confrontation with violence. I think the region, violence has never been very foreign to us. Unfortunately, we've suffered violence in the last many decades. The century has been a very harsh century filled with violence. But I think people would agree that what we witnessed after 2011 has been largely unprecedented. So the levels of brutality, violation, atrocities, this is an epoch of atrocities. And so subjects of how do you face that? How do you reconstitute life, human life? How, if you're an artist or a thinker or just a living being in the area, how do you recreate meaning? And then also the whole issue of humanism, but not as some doctrine, but really because we've witnessed the humans being ripped apart. And so there is an ethics, a lot of ethics writing that was not that present before 2011. The issue of power, whether it's state, religion, because we've witnessed, state brutality, religious fanaticism and violence, and gender that has been really accompanying most, if not really all, of the demonstrations, of the revolts. A good part of it has been also connected to gender issues. And the last very important issue that has arisen from the Gaza war, I think, is the question of the universal. For many of us, for most of us in the region, the Gaza war is a turning point in marking really the moral fall of the West. That not only, everybody knew the double standards and that our lives are worthless and all of that. And that, there was a fake discourse of universalism and universal values. Hidden behind it were all sorts of racist politics. But this time, it's the fall of that facade itself. It's really not only allowing discriminatory killing to happen, but also justifying it. And that's really a new level that leaves us, many of us, really dazzled at this unprecedented fall of the universal. And for me, what is interesting is, what do we do with that? How do we now, people at the receiving end of this in the region, deal with the universal? What do we do? Do we abandon it and say, see, it was all the time a lie, so why care, or let's go back to our own values, etc.? Or do we give this universal and this universal human a new credibility? And how do we do it? Now, I thought I would end with this painting by the Lebanese painter Taghreed Darghout from her series, The Tree Within a Palestinian Olive Tree. Now, Taghreed is known for her very powerful and lush brushstrokes. And she has been interacting really the last couple of decades with the dramatic events in the region, in Lebanon. She has been depicting the brutal militarization of the area, representing helicopters, bombs, also depicting surveillance machines, cameras, depicting the Beirut port explosion and all sorts of other exciting events that keep on happening to us. So this is her Palestinian olive tree. And with this, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. Yes, if you can minimize that so we can see you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kassab. You gave us so much to think with. I'm going to give the students an opportunity to ask questions first. I have a few myself, but yeah, so we have many. We start with Mohammed.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. A question for you. Do you think that when people are trying to conceive of these themes after 2011, they are sometimes often faced with the weight that these past themes, the ones before 2011, sometimes impose on us and how we think? How can one historicize that?
Good question. Good question, which helps me qualify, if you want, my statement. I don't think that those binaries have disappeared. You would still find people, you know, go la hadasa wal mu'asara, and this endless. Our job now is to observe how much of a scope they still have. Where are the other discourses arising? Who's saying what? So you're absolutely right. We're not talking about take a drastic shift that suddenly the old themes have disappeared. It's rather this recalibration or the emergence of other discourses and other speakers also. Where do you look for them? Whom do you listen to? And so our job as followers of the scene has also changed. I mean, it has encouraged us to learn to change our habits of listening, to start looking in perhaps other places, alternative places.
Thank you.
Zainab?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm curious if you would kind of reflect on how you've seen your like research on contemporary Arab thought like be perceived in like Western institutions compared to where you teach at Doha Institute, where it's like you're dealing with, for example, students who are, primarily Arab, but like there's Arabic language instruction at Doha Institute as well. So like, do you kind of see a difference in the way that you kind of like talk about your research or have your thesis or like your research be perceived, like at Doha Institute compared to like a place like Georgetown or like other Western institutions? Also, like your book being published with like Columbia University like press, this is also like tied to a Western institution. So how do you kind of like see your work be positioned like in across these different places?
I have something autistic about my practice. I write primarily for myself, and I search and work for myself because I myself need to understand these are issues that interest me. So I write about things that interest me. But I think that beyond that, it does interest, it seems to me, others. And it, well, beyond that very personal connection, if you want, this is a kind of claim to knowledge, or I present something and then it's open to everyone who's interested to look into it and do whatever they want with it. But I do admit that it gives me particular pleasure and fulfillment to share all of this with young people of the region, because it concerns, it's things that affect our lives. It has that dimension to it, if you want, that perhaps doesn't exist for other people. So yeah, it has a special flavor to it. Teaching at Doha in Arabic to young people from the area has a very rewarding aspect to it.
I'm gonna ask a question from online that is somewhat related to this. So Ben asked, can you speak to the question of language? How does contemporary Arabic thought look different when you read in French or English, Fusha or colloquial?
As a Lebanese, I'm such a bastard, such a mixture of everything that the multiple languages and colloquia are part of our existence. So I'm not very much conscious of it, self-conscious of it. I just shift from one language to another. I read everything that I can read that comes under my eyes. So, but apart from that, yes, it would be interesting to see whether writers, so-called thinkers, write in different way when they write in different languages. For that, I would need a social scientist, but it would be irrelevant, an interesting question.
Great. We have some other, Batul?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, for your actually thoughts. It's amazing. Actually, for me, I joined. I have joined academia, and it was like the same period of time that was happening and what was like still happening in Gaza. So I felt like I'm doubtful actually because of this gap between like the intellectual discourse and the community-driven initiatives and what's really happening on the ground. So my question actually, how we can actually we still start on academia and the writing and like investigating many intellectuals. So how do you see the role of intellectuals evolving in response to such as you mentioned, to genocides as what's happening in Gaza? Are there like, I know there's examples of a grassroots and of movements. So do you think that are there examples where their work, the intellectuals has successfully influenced local movements?
Listen, your question is a
Yeah.
broad one that has to do with where is relevant thought produced. Yani,
Exactly.
thought that is related to what happens to us, to what is relevant to us. And when I say us, it's people living in that area. And I think that it's a very broad question, and it has something to do, for instance, a critique of our universities. And I am involved in the Arab Council for the Social Sciences, and one of the previous, we have a conference every 2 years, and there is one upcoming now in May. It's always in Beirut. And the previous conference had as its theme, where are the centers of knowledge and thought? Because unfortunately, many of our universities, I'm talking about the Arab region now, are disconnected and produce, either produce nothingness or are totally hooked to the Western discourse. So what is produced there somehow is irrelevant to us, unfortunately. However, some of it is highly relevant. So we have to be careful, I think, to be very discerning here and not throw large judgments. But I think that now Western academia is a different story. That's a different chapter. But as far as the Arab academia is concerned, it has been lagging behind. And indeed, the more interesting stuff is elsewhere, is in small organizations, people coming together, establishing reading groups, establishing research centers. But you're right that disconnect is there. This disconnect.
Yeah, thank you.
Michelle?
Thank you for your talk, Professor. It was very enlightening. I'd like to ask you on the question of universalism and whether you think this is a pressing question, both for the Arab world politically, socially, and philosophically, and whether this is an important category to hold on to. Is it useful, or perhaps it comes with more pitfalls than solutions? Yeah, it's a big question, but I'd love to hear more thoughts from you.
This is the $1 million question. This is the question that we're facing. As I said, you're absolutely right. I think these are all legitimate questions, and we are facing them. What do we do? Do we say that this was not an important issue to start with? Who needs universals? What is the universal we're talking about? What fall are we talking about? What really has happened with the fall of the Western credibility related to the universal? I think I myself, I cannot say that I have grasped really the meaning of what has happened. Yani, because in the area we're used to double standards. So it's not something new. We know that what counts for a Westerner doesn't count for us, etc. But here I think we've reached something else, because the values are being put in question, not with respect to me, but with respect to the Western person, him or herself. In other words, liberties are not being denied to us, that we know. It's being denied to public debate in Germany, in France, in the US. So this is, I think, the new dimension, that at the end of the day, I was used to the French telling me, yes, democracy and all the liberties, and but at the same time sort of treating me as in my country as a lesser or not really worthy of. And suddenly the powers to be, whether academic power, institutional power, or political power, is denying these values to their own citizens. So now we're really facing a putting in question of the values in the places where they were supposed to be upheld. And even we used to say, Wallah, see, there is democracy in Germany, there is free public debate in Germany, and we wish we could have that because free, rational public debate is a good thing for us too. This is something we value, we yearn for. And suddenly it falls where it was supposed to be upheld. And what are the consequences of this for us? I think we haven't finished figuring out the consequences. We need to, I mean, I, for one, think it's worth contemplating. What are the implications of this?
If I may, I just make a comment about that. I mean, I think that's something that folks, because in the US, you know, the suppression of speech around Israel and Palestine has a long history. It's been intensified because of how many people are speaking up, really, in some respects. But I think for a while, folks have argued that this is such a slippery slope, right? And so you started having legislation at the state level banning people from boycotting Israel. Then you started having legislation against critical race theory. And what we tried to say to many others, right, is when you do this to us, you're normalizing this kind of suppression of free speech. And now we see it amplified, right, with this current administration. So it's not that the current administration created this, but there's been a long kind of, you know, several decades of repressing, particularly any speech critical of Israel in the country. And now it's kind of the chickens are coming home to roost, as they say, right? And so I really appreciate that angle of this because it's something I think we're seeing really come to fruition here in the US.
You're right. It's the principle really. Again, I go back to that. We were used to the idea that, yeah, they hold these principles for themselves, but then when it comes to us, you know, tayyib. But here it's, because it's amplified, then the principle itself is being put in question, not with respect to the Palestinian question only, not with respect to race, not, so it's, once you start giving up on the integrity of the principle, where does this lead you? So in that sense, it is really, for us, watching this from afar, it's really the crumbling of the whole set of principles.
There's one question online related to this a bit, so I just want to share that, which is, do you think that the war in Gaza has fundamentally shaken contemporary Arab thought, as the Arab Spring did? The so-called double standards of the West regarding Palestine is not new. I mean, I guess it's still early to see, but have you seen evidence of the ways in which people are expressing this?
I don't know about evidence, but I think that the Gaza war is definitely another turning point in many respects. First of all, for all of what we mentioned here in terms of values, universality, etc. About violence, I think atrocities, this will have that definitely atrocities and picking up life after that has become a central topic in today's contemporary Arab thought. That this is it was not there before 2011, although we had, as I said, witnessed, you know, chapters and chapters of violence, but that we were, and all this too is something we need to figure out. I have presented it at Doha, and we do talk about it among ourselves, colleagues and people. What is special about Gaza? And I think one of the things is that we were subjected to witnessing it for a long time. It was not bombing Gaza for a week. It was not, you know, perpetrating massacres for 2 weeks. It was making us watch for months and now years, absolute atrocity. What does this tell us? What does this do to us? Is something I think we cannot evade. Yani I might not be able to present evidence in the sense of, show me books, I can show you books. The work of Yassin Haj Saleh, for instance, precisely on the atrocity, Al-Fadhi' wa Tamthiluhu, is, I think, a long essay which is a reflection on the experience of atrocity and how you recreate life and human life after that. I think we are in the middle of it.
Thank you. Wow. Like, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I can ask you a million questions, but I'm gonna go to the question that I had written before regarding the Arab Spring. I was interested from the articles that you had suggested for us to read. How do you assess the role of intellectuals who lean towards the Muslim Brotherhood or political Islam, particularly in Egypt and Tunis? And were they perceived as outsiders within the broader circle of public intellectuals, particularly in contrast to like the secular or leftist intellectuals? And additionally, how did their engagement with political power affect their intellectual standing and discourse on democracy governance in the post-revolutionary period?
Very good questions. And I think this is something that is being studied by some of my colleagues, and it's something happening as we speak. This process is ongoing. As you said, the experience of power, not a very happy experience. What kinds of revisions is this, if at all, has it given rise to? I think this is, I haven't been studying that, but I think it is an important part of the intellectual landscape, because I think political Islam, since the Arab revolts, has also been through a lot of upheavals and transformations that certainly will give rise to revisions of sorts. And I think studying those transformations and their is also part of what needs to be done, definitely. And the seculars too, by the way.
Other part. So there's a question online about what do you think that current Arab thinkers have learned from kind of reflecting on the older generation and how they overlooked ordinary people participating in the revolts. Like, so is there sort of a taking stock of that amongst a newer generation and their approach to work? And in some ways, you've been taking stock, right? You talked yourself about your own reflections, but yeah.
I think one has to be careful when we speak about the scene, the intellectual scene, as a monolithic one, because it's really a very varied one. One should be careful not to be reductionist and not to reduce Arab thought to a few of the major thinkers, major in the sense that they had the most readership or number of books or sales or what have you. That itself is an interesting topic, no? I always ask my students, my colleagues, why was Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri a star? What made the stardom of this thinker? How did he become popular? What made his popularity? I don't have answers. This is why I think it's scandalous from me to claim that, wallah, I understand. No, I don't know. Or sometimes people tell me that what is the impact of this book or that other book on what is the readership? I have no clue. I would like some sociologists, we had no sociology of knowledge. I would like somebody or many people to go and do that kind of investigation. But it seems to me that the pressure of events has taken care of a lot of things. In other words, given what is happening today, I think you have, or you, it is a luxury now to sit down and say, well, let me read what this guy in the 70s said about modernity. There is a structure of relevance that is created by the events themselves, but these are all impressions by an ignorant like me. To have really substantial, respectful answers, one has to go and do systematic social scientific work and investigation.
Sort of related to that, because someone online asked, one of the students online asked about kind of how you're incorporating these insights about like art and visual culture into your own work. And it's sort of related to a question I was thinking about was when you're suggesting that we read these things, we do these things not in isolation. Is this, I mean, I was thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not necessarily about the single author, right? Not everyone can do all of this, but those of us interested in intellectual movement should be reading broadly across these kind of different spaces. But you also talked about the challenge of kind of, you had 3 books and they're not citing each other. They're not in conversation with each other. So in your own work, how do you see, like because your new book is not a new book entirely. The introduction is new. How has this shaped your own work moving forward, or how do you hope it will shape your own work moving forward?
I think it's important to engage conversations. Like, I have great pleasure, to give you a simple answer, Yani, to this complex questions. I have great pleasure in talking to colleagues of mine who are doing this kind of work, with Zena Maasri, with Bahia Shahab, with Jana Trabulsi, many people who are working in their own, they are art historians, they are graphic designers. I think bringing issues together and say, when I ask them, you know, how have artists been dealing with the question of modernity? I think this kind of basic conversation is very useful to broaden our perspective. It's always good to have a broad perspective. And also, I think what I find very urgent is to deconstruct the logocentric patriarchal domination of what is called Arab thought, is to really deflect or yani to provincialize. This is the word. I would like to say, okay, there is this set of writings, which I called contemporary Arab thought. This is only part of the picture. There are other pieces of the puzzle. And the more we bring in pieces together, the better is our understanding. And I think it also has something, it will change our definition of thought. And if we're used to say, wallah, thought happens only in the books of these men who often talk to each other, we would have gained something. Yani, it's a useful insight. And because also we all know, yani, we see that there is more to thought than what appears in those books. So we might as well, you know, enrich our lives and our understanding of thought and not have it limited to a small sector of it. And not be logocentric, not privilege certain kinds of, or at least know that there are different loci of thought production that can or might not want to engage with one another.
Thank you. Rania, did you have a question? Yeah.
Thanks for your thoughts and insights. Regarding like your book and articles, actually, there's like many questions rises like from this about the role of the intellectuals in political movement. Can intellectuals be like activists, observers, and mediators? I feel like when I read more, I feel no, they can be this or no, they can be this. You know, at the end, I feel like I'm stuck in no. We can like combine everything at the same time, or like everyone has his own thoughts and way in his field. Yeah, thank you.
If I understood your question correctly, are you saying the status of the thinker, المفكر?
Yeah, the role of the
Seems to
intellectuals.
me, when I'm in a bad mood or I want to be nasty, I say that these guys behave like muftis. You know, that al-qawl, the say of that authority, that kind of patriarchal authority with which they tell you what Arabs think, or worse, what Arabs should be thinking. There is that kind of authority associated with a certain status that reproduces itself. And you find these 5, 6 men talking to one another and then telling us this is Arab thought. Now, wait a minute. I tell them, wait a minute. There are others thinking as well, and there are other forms of thinking. And if I limit my study to them, then I would be perpetuating that kind of authority as well. There are young people thinking, there are women thinking, there are all sorts of people thinking in different ways. And so this monopoly of the patriarchal word needs to be shaken a little bit.
Do you have time for one more question? I hope so. I hope we can. Bob? Yeah.
I have a question about, you said you distinguished between like intellectual action and political action. You said it's like there's different roles for politicians and intellectual, but they are linked. So I was like very interested like to hear about how you envision this link, especially that you talked about also that intellectual to do their role, they need some sort of freedom and to do it correctly. So how can they do their roles without compromising? And I don't know if you understood my question.
No, wait a minute. I didn't hear you properly at the beginning. You were saying the difference between the intellectual and what?
Political.
And the political.
Especially that the intellectual freedom is also linked to the political, aspect, and
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. And now, when I spoke about these, ubiquitous themes of modernity, and somebody like Faisal Darraj, a good critical thinker, Palestinian Syrian, he used to say that this suits governments. Regimes are very happy when you talk about authenticity and you create these debates about, selfhood and al-mu'asara wal-hadasa, and of course not speak about economic policies, about a lack of political participation. As long as you're talking about these culturalist issues, you're fine. No, I'm not saying, of course, I'm being a bit too maybe extreme here. There are some men who also produced very valuable critical ideas, and I do cover them in my book. But of course, there is this interplay between political repression and the kinds of topics that are allowed and that are perpetuated. And I must say, when I speak about the Minority Report, I must say that there were people extremely courageous and extremely honest under the fiercest regimes, like in Syria, who did speak about repression, about human dignity, about the destruction of the human. This is what I tried to cover in my Tanwir book, in the Enlightenment book. So this is the Minority Report, and it existed. And I wanted to shed light on it so that they don't get lost, that as a tribute also to these very courageous people. And it took really, really a lot of courage and honesty to say things as they are under Assad's regime. And these people did exist.
On that note, we want to thank you once again. Thank you so much. We have the opportunity to meet in Doha.
Inshallah. أهلا وسهلا.
Inshallah. So I will let you know. Yeah.
Or also in Beirut, تعالوا على ال ACSS conference.
Yeah. I was hoping to come this year. My brother's getting married at the same time, so I have a priority. Inshallah, Sanjay. Yeah.
All right.
We try to share information about the conference with students
Please
as well.
do.
Okay.
Please. Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah.